Right now, meteorologists around the world are still going through the data from one of the most powerful storms of the entire year, a storm that tore through United States territory with winds strong enough to be classified as the equivalent of a Category 5 hurricane, Super Typhoon. Bavi reached maximum sustained winds of over 180 miles per hour before slamming directly into the Northern Mariana Islands, passing over the island of Rota with a ferocity that local authorities are still assessing block by block. This wasn't a storm that grazed the coastline and moved on. This was a direct hit at peak intensity on a community of just a few thousand people, and it happened for the second time in 3 months. Today, we're going to break down exactly how Bavi became this powerful, what actually happened when it made landfall, why this region keeps getting hit so hard this year, and what it tells us about the rest of this storm season. No guessing, no dramatizing, just the facts, the data, and what it actually means. Before we get into it, drop a comment right now. Have you ever been through a hurricane or typhoon, or do you live somewhere that regularly deals with tropical storms? Tell me where you were. If you want to be the first to know every time a storm like this develops, subscribe. It's completely free, and it genuinely helps this channel keep going. Let's try to get this one to 5,000 likes, so the algorithm puts it in front of more people who need to see it. Thank you. Now, let's get into it. Let's start with how Bavi actually formed, because the speed of this storm's development is honestly one of the most alarming parts of the entire story. Bavi began as a fairly unremarkable tropical storm system east of Guam. Within roughly 48 hours, it underwent what meteorologists call rapid intensification, a process where a storm's wind speeds increase by at least 35 miles per hour within a single 24-hour period. Bavi didn't just hit that threshold, it blew past it. The Joint Typhoon Warning Center in Hawaii had initially been tracking it as a system that might reach typhoon strength within a day, and instead watched it explode into a full Category 4, and then Category 5, equivalent super typhoon, in a matter of hours. The reason this happened comes down to almost perfect conditions for storm growth. Sea surface temperatures in the region were sitting around 86 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 30 degrees Celsius, which is well above the threshold typically needed to fuel a major tropical cyclone. But it wasn't just the surface temperature that mattered here, it was the depth of that warm water. Storms don't just feed off the surface layer of the ocean, they churn up water from below as they move, and if that deeper water is also warm, the storm has an almost unlimited fuel source instead of cooling itself down by pulling up colder water from underneath. In Bavi's case, that ocean heat content was measured at over 110 kilojoules per square centimeter, an exceptionally high number that gave the storm a deep reservoir of warm water to draw from. On top of that, wind shear in the region, the difference in wind speed and direction at different altitudes, was unusually low, sitting around just 5 to 10 knots. High wind shear tends to tear a storm apart before it can organize properly. Low wind shear does the opposite. It lets a storm build a clean, symmetrical structure and intensify without interference. Put all three of those ingredients together, exceptionally warm surface water, deep warm water beneath it, and minimal wind shear, and you get exactly the kind of explosive intensification that turned Bavi from a tropical storm into one of the strongest cyclones on the planet this year in under 2 days. By the time Bavi reached its peak, the Japan Meteorological Agency, which is the official agency responsible for typhoon warnings across the Northwest Pacific, measured its central pressure at 935 millibars, with 10-minute sustained winds of around 110 miles per hour. Now, that number might sound lower than the headline you've probably seen, and here's why. The Joint Typhoon Warning Center measures wind speed differently, using a 1-minute sustained average instead of a 10-minute average, which is why you'll often see the same storm reported with sustained winds well above 180 miles per hour from that agency. Both numbers are accurate. They're just measuring the storm using different standards, which is actually a really important thing to understand anytime you're comparing storm strength reported by different countries or agencies. Regardless of which measurement you use, this was an extraordinarily powerful storm, one of only a handful of storms anywhere on the planet this year to reach the equivalent of Category 5 strength. When Bavi's eye passed directly over Rota, an island home to roughly 2,000 people, the impact was immediate and severe. Local authorities reported major damage across the island almost as soon as conditions allowed them to assess it. Fallen trees littered roads and properties. Buildings experienced significant water intrusion, with reports of flooding pouring into hotels and homes as the storm's outer bands and heavy rain bands moved through ahead of and behind the eye wall. Ports across the region were forced to close, and the United States Coast Guard had to work to reopen Guam and the surrounding Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands ports in the days that followed. A process that takes time even after the winds die down, because ports have to be inspected for structural damage and cleared of debris before ships and supplies can move again safely. This wasn't the first time this year that this exact region has been hit this hard. Just months earlier, in April, Typhoon Sinlaku, an even more powerful storm with 1-minute sustained winds reaching 180 miles per hour and a central pressure that dropped to just 896 millibars, made landfall over the same general area, with its enormous eye passing directly over both Tinian and Saipan simultaneously. Sinlaku's impact was severe, contributing to a season that has already recorded dozens of fatalities and hundreds of millions of dollars in damage. So think about what that actually means for the roughly 50,000 people who call the Northern Mariana Islands home. Twice in the span of 3 months, a storm strong enough to be classified at the very top of the intensity scale has made a direct hit on their communities. This raises the obvious question, why does this particular region keep getting hit so hard, and is this year unusual? The Western Pacific is, on average, the most active tropical cyclone basin on the entire planet, responsible for roughly a third of all named tropical storms worldwide in a typical year. The same warm ocean temperatures and atmospheric patterns that make this region a haven for coral reefs and marine biodiversity also make it an extremely efficient engine for generating and intensifying typhoons. The Northern Mariana Islands and Guam sit almost directly in the path that a huge number of these storms take as they move west and northwest across the open Pacific, before eventually reaching Asia, which means these islands function almost like a gauntlet that a significant portion of the season's storms have to pass through or near. As for whether this year specifically has been unusual, the data suggests it has been an active one. Bobby was confirmed as the third Category 5 equivalent storm globally in 2026, following Sinlaku in April. Getting 3 storms of that intensity by the middle of the year is a notable pace, though it's worth being careful here. A single active season, even a genuinely severe one, doesn't necessarily tell us much on its own about long-term trends. What it does tell us is that warm ocean conditions this year have been very favorable for storm intensification, and that the islands sitting in the path of these systems have had very little time to recover between major impacts. It's also worth understanding how forecasters actually track and predict a storm like this, because the amount of advance warning available today is dramatically different than it was even 20 years ago. Storms like Bavi are tracked continuously using a combination of geostationary weather satellites, which sit in a fixed position relative to the Earth and can watch the same region of ocean non-stop, and polar orbiting satellites like the ones operated by NOAA, which pass over different parts of the planet on a rotating basis but carry extremely detailed sensors capable of measuring cloud top temperatures, wind patterns, and moisture content. The VIIR's instrument, which stands for Visible Infrared Imaging Radiometer Suite, flying on NOAA's satellites, was actually able to capture a striking nighttime image of Bavi's eye illuminated by moonlight as it passed just north of Guam, giving forecasters and the public alike a clear look at the storm's structure in the middle of the night. On top of satellite tracking, forecasters run multiple independent computer models, often referred to by their initials, like the European model and the American GFS model, which use current atmospheric data to simulate how a storm is likely to move and intensify over the coming days. When these models agree closely with each other, forecasters can issue confident predictions. When they diverge, forecasters have to communicate a wider range of possible outcomes, which is part of why you'll sometimes see a forecast cone that seems to shift meaningfully from one advisory to the next. That's not the forecasters getting it wrong. That's the genuine uncertainty of predicting a chaotic system being reflected honestly in the forecast. Looking ahead, forecasters at Colorado State University, one of the most respected sources for seasonal hurricane and typhoon outlooks, have pointed to a strong El Nino pattern as a major factor shaping the rest of this year's storm activity. In the Atlantic, that same El Nino pattern is expected to increase wind shear, which actually tends to suppress storm development, leading to a forecast for a below-average probability of major hurricane landfalls along the continental United States and Caribbean this season. But, and this is a point forecasters make every single year for good reason, a below-average seasonal forecast does not mean a safe season. It only takes one storm making landfall in the wrong place to turn an otherwise quiet year into a devastating one for the community that gets hit, which is exactly why coastal communities are always encouraged to prepare thoroughly every single season, regardless of what the seasonal outlook predicts. In the Pacific, meanwhile, the season has already proven itself to be active, with the first named storm of the year forming in mid-January, the earliest start to a Pacific typhoon season since 2019, and multiple systems, including Bavi and Sinlaku, already reaching major typhoon strength well before the traditional peak of the season even arrives. It's also worth taking a moment to explain how storms like Bavi actually get classified in the first place, because the terminology can get confusing fast, especially when you're comparing a Pacific typhoon to an Atlantic hurricane. Structurally, a typhoon and a hurricane are the exact same type of storm. A tropical cyclone with a well-organized center of low pressure and a closed circulation of winds rotating around it. The only real difference is location. In the Western Pacific, these storms are called typhoons, In the Atlantic and Eastern Pacific, they're called hurricanes. In the Indian Ocean and around Australia, they're typically called cyclones. Same physical phenomenon, 3 different regional names. Once a storm forms, it gets ranked using wind speed as the primary measure, most commonly through the Saffir-Simpson scale in the case of hurricanes, which runs from Category 1 through Category 5. A Category 5 storm, the highest classification, requires sustained winds of at least 157 miles per hour. Bobby's peak winds, depending on which agency's measurement standard you use, were reported well above that threshold, which is exactly why it's being described as the equivalent of a Category 5 storm, even though the Saffir-Simpson scale itself is technically an Atlantic and Eastern Pacific hurricane classification system rather than an official typhoon scale. The term super typhoon is the Western Pacific's own version of that top-tier classification, generally applied once sustained winds cross roughly 150 miles per hour. Understanding this distinction matters because it explains why you might see a single storm described with slightly different numbers depending on the source, without either source actually being wrong. The Northern Mariana Islands and Guam have a long, difficult history with typhoons, largely because of their geographic position almost directly in the main development region for Western Pacific tropical cyclones. This is not a region where a major typhoon is a rare, once-in-a-generation event. It's a region that has learned out of necessity to build infrastructure specifically designed to withstand extreme wind loads, to maintain emergency shelters capable of housing displaced residents on short notice, and to coordinate closely with the United States Coast Guard and federal emergency management resources, given their status as U.S. territories. That existing infrastructure and experience is part of why, even after a direct hit from a storm as powerful as Bavi, initial reports focused on damage assessment and recovery rather than mass casualties, though the human cost of repeated major storms in a single season should never be understated, particularly for a community as small as Rhoda's roughly 2,000 residents, where nearly every household is directly affected when a storm this strong makes landfall. There's also a broader climate context worth mentioning here, carefully and accurately. Scientists have observed that as ocean surface and subsurface temperatures rise globally, tropical cyclones have an increasing tendency toward rapid intensification, the exact process that turned Bobby from a moderate tropical storm into a Category 5 equivalent super typhoon in roughly 48 hours. This doesn't mean every storm is getting stronger, and it doesn't mean this specific season can be attributed entirely to any single cause. Typhoon seasons vary naturally year to year based on complex atmospheric patterns like El Niño and La Niña wind shear, and countless other regional factors that meteorologists spend entire careers studying. What the broader scientific research does consistently show is that warmer ocean water provides more available energy for storms to draw on when conditions otherwise allow them to intensify, which is part of why events like Bavi's explosive 48-hour intensification are exactly the kind of pattern that atmospheric scientists are watching closely across multiple ocean basins, not just the Western Pacific. At the end of the day, storms like Bavi are a powerful reminder of just how much energy the ocean is capable of holding, and how quickly that energy can organize into something capable of reshaping an entire island's landscape in the span of a single night. The people of Rota, Guam, Saipan, and Tinian are not just data points in a seasonal typhoon count, they're communities now facing the very real work of clearing debris, restoring power, reopening ports, and rebuilding for the second time this year alone. Understanding exactly how a storm like this forms, why certain regions are hit again and again, and how forecasters manage to track it with the precision they do, it doesn't just make for a more accurate video, it gives you a genuinely better sense of the forces constantly moving across the ocean surface of this planet, often far from where most of us are ever paying close attention. It's worth pausing on the recovery process too, because that part of the story tends to get far less attention than the storm itself, even though it often takes much longer. In the immediate aftermath of a storm like Bavi, the first priority is almost always search and rescue and confirming the safety of residents, followed quickly by restoring essential services, power, running water, and communications, which can be knocked out for days or even weeks, depending on how severely the local grid was damaged. Ports have to be carefully inspected before they can reopen, because submerged debris, damaged docks, and navigational hazards can pose serious risks to incoming supply ships, which are often critical for delivering fuel, food, and building materials to island communities that can't simply drive in reinforcements from a neighboring region the way a mainland community might. Airports face similar inspection requirements before flights can safely resume. All of this means that even once the wind has died down and the skies have cleared, a community like Rota can be looking at weeks of disrupted daily life, and in cases of severe structural damage, months or longer before full recovery. This is part of why repeated direct hits within the same season, as we saw with Sinlaku in April and now Bavi in July, can be so much more damaging cumulatively than the raw wind speed numbers alone might suggest, because it compresses the recovery timeline and strains resources that hadn't yet been fully replenished from the last event. We'll keep tracking storm activity across the Pacific and bring you an update the moment anything meaningfully changes, whether that's a new system developing or updated damage assessments from Bavi's landfall. If this kind of grounded fact-verse coverage is something you want more of, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep making it. Let's try to hit 5,000 likes on this one together. Thank you so much for watching this. Stay curious, stay informed, and I will see you in the next one.